Today we're going to be talking about the video game Hearts of Iron 4. And we'll start out, as we always do here, with the disclaimer. The game was played on easy and normal difficulty. All of the expansion DLC was active during the playthroughs. No mods were active, however. Only single-player content will be reviewed or analyzed. And the game was purchased some time ago, so it can be considered a sunk cost. Furthermore, the game was played through multiple times with multiple different settings and nations. Moving right along to Immersion. Now, this is a little bit of a difficult to explain area. We'll start off with the game attempts to immerse the player with statistics. There are veritable walls of statistics in this game for players to look at, analyze, and attempt to optimize. Graphically, the game world is very interesting. It's a representation of the real world with country outlines that are instantly relatable, and so it does that very effectively. Story, the game does not necessarily have a pre-planned story. Yes, there are events that occur, and they can be vaguely said to be historical, but the real story of the game is what the player makes up for themselves and how they react to the things that happen in the game world. And the game does present a challenge. It does attempt to immerse the player by throwing up those events that we just mentioned. There's a lot of tactical puzzles, a lot of strategic puzzles that the game will present players with that they have to then decipher. And so that can be very immersive. Player agency. Now this is another thing that the game attempts to do, and it's essentially every nation is, or will be at some point here, essentially its own thing with a unique experience. Unique ships, unique planes, and unique research trees, and that's something that really does help to immerse the player. Additionally, the game presents a large number of customizable rules, customizable settings for the game world that players can use to essentially recreate the world to make certain events happen, make certain events not happen, or make one country stronger than another, to essentially custom fit the world to their desires and their desires, their expectations. And that's going to bring us on to our next. So that brings us on to difficulty. The game does provide a fully featured tutorial, and it's important to play through the tutorial possibly more than once to understand all of the options that players have available to them and how to work through them. The icons can be somewhat difficult to discern, especially once we get a couple of layers deep into a menu. The basic menu icons are not terribly difficult to discern. An Erlenmeyer flask often means research in these sorts of grand strategy games, so that's not all that difficult. The game provides numerous options for adjusting difficulty and adjusting various parameters of the world, as we mentioned in the immersion section. And those will impact difficulty, but it's not necessarily all that obvious how these sliders and click and radio buttons will and checkboxes will impact difficulty, but they are there, so that's why we do think that the game has earned an 8 out of 15 for its difficulty. Moving right along, bring us to the lasting appeal of the game. And this is another difficult to quantify thing. And what it comes down to is the appeal of this game is going to depend a lot on how familiar players are with this period of history and with these countries and what happened during this time. And players who are not necessarily overly familiar with this are not going to really be too immersed in the game world, and are not going to want to play it for very long because they're going to get confused. They're going to wonder who was this person? They just have no interest in it. So if this is not that player's preferred period of history, it's safe to skip it. The game is, however, very supportive of mods, and those are a point in its favor. The replay value is fairly substantial because, as we mentioned earlier in the Immersion section, essentially every nation on the planet it represents, or nearly that, represents a unique experience. There is a significant amount of DLC. The DLC policies and the prices charged are not necessarily something that we're going to be discussing, but it is very well supported. The game does require a substantial commitment from players to get a lot out of it. It can be played for a long time or a short time, so overall we do assess that it has earned an 8 out of 15. Much of that is dependent upon based on the fact that yes, it does have lasting appeal for players that are interested in what this particular game world is, but for players who really are not interested in the game world, or this period in history, we should say, it's not going to immerse them. It's not going to last very long with them. They're going to move right along to something else. So in the final analysis, the game has earned a 10 out of 15. The mileage of each individual player will vary depending on their interest in the time period and which mods that they choose to play with. So it really can't be put more succinctly than that. If this is not your particular favorite time period, if there are not mods that the particular player is interested in, then it really doesn't matter what the game offers. So a 10 out of 15 is what the game has earned. And thanks very much for paying attention, and that's all we've got for today.